systems before they're spray dried are evaporated. And the reason for that is energy saving. But I said that if you have a very high solids content in your concentrate when it's going to be dried, the increased viscosity results in a larger droplet size during drying. And if you have a larger droplet size, you have a larger particle size. In that context, when I say a larger particle size, I mean there's one single particle called a primary particle that gets bigger. So this is just one single particle, a continuous particle. It's called a primary particle, and if we have a high solids content, then the particle tends to be bigger. Okay? So if you produce larger particles through that kind of process by concentrating a very high viscous material, that doesn't really give you many functional benefits, okay? So you have larger particles, but there's not really much of a functional benefit. So this is purely just a function of viscosity. And that's what we were saying about the presence of fat can increase viscosity, an increased solids content can increase viscosity, or the promotion of whey protein denaturation can increase viscosity. So that's one way of increasing particle size. Another way of increasing particle size is agglomeration, which is the thing that you covered earlier. So there are two different things like that. And in agglomeration, we have multiple primary particles. We have individual primary particles that are bonded together chemically. And oftentimes during the production of powders, not just milk powders, but also protein powders like whey protein isolates, which we'll encounter later, manufacturers wish to create this type of structure, an agglomerate of individual primary particles. So this is a good thing. And one of the primary reasons why this type of structure is created is to promote the solubilization of particles. So when you create these little capillary structures in here, this tends to draw water into the particle structure. So it creates a capillary pressure gradient, which basically sucks water into the structure and solubilizes it more quickly. So the primary benefit to agglomeration is promoting the rapid solubilization of powders. Now, one important thing to remember in terms of the link between processing and functionality in the context of skim milk powder and whole milk powder, and I'll say this again in a few minutes, is that for a skim milk powder, it is sufficient to agglomerate it if you want to promote what's called instant-like properties. So if you want your skim milk powder to be like this, which is this is the one I was trying to remember in the lecture last week. This is a supermarket brand of skim milk powder. And if you were to pour this out of the package, you'd see very large, almost, in some cases, millimeter-sized particles, okay? So they're agglomerated. And the idea is that if someone was pouring this into their cup of tea or coffee or something, it dissolves instantly to the point where you barely even have to stir it. Okay? So it's a very desirable functional property. In contrast to that, anyone here who's ever had to dissolve a whey protein isolate, for example, when they're going to the gym, they tend to be very difficult to dissolve, and that's considered a negative property of those powders. So for a skim milk powder, it is sufficient to agglomerate the powder if you want instant-like properties. For a whole milk powder, it is not sufficient to agglomerate the powder particles. So we'll see this again in a few minutes, but it's important for you to remember, and I'm sure you'll hear more about it from Seamus. Agglomeration is a sufficient step to improve the solubility of skim milk powder. It necessary to improve the solubility of a whole milk powder, but it is not sufficient. You need something else due to the presence of fat. So in a whole milk powder, for example, you can have a lovely agglomerate like this, and it could be coated in fat on the outside. So you add the agglomerate to water, and it still doesn't really solubilize because the fat is repelling the water. Okay? So you need something else. So there's various details up here about agglomeration. There's some secondary benefits, so there's improved fluidity. Okay? So normally in a powder, you have a random dispersion of solid particles. You have small ones, you have big ones, you have a mixture of sizes, and the small particles can, over time, fit within large particles, and you can get compression of the powder, which reduces flow. But here you're creating relatively stable structures where you don't have that compression happening over time. The particles are bound together in a structure, and we have multiple of these type of agglomerate structures, and they don't tend to fit between each other in the same way as this random dispersion of solid particles. So that's a secondary benefit. The agglomeration process tends to produce very flowable powders. Another thing to keep in mind as the hours go by and you move on to Seamus's section is that there are certain disadvantages to agglomeration of very practical consequence in an actual factory environment. So one thing you're probably not familiar with at this point is that a lot of powders in factories are transported pneumatically. Does anyone know what that means? Pneumatic transport. Like, I don't know if they ever actually did this. I think they did, but in old sci-fi movies, it was considered futuristic if they showed an office building where the mail was being transported around the office building pneumatically. So there'd be like a pipe next to someone's desk, and someone would put a cartridge into the pipe and it would just go, and it would just shoot around the building to another office. So it's pressurized air. So in factories, once a powder is produced, if it has to be moved around the factory, it's moved through a network of pipes under pressurized air. So what you do with liquids, you pump them. You can't really pump a powder like you would a liquid. So you have to move it a different way. You move it pneumatically under pressurized air. Now, one of the things Seamus is going to talk to you about is how if you want to move a powder, for example, through a pipe network that looks like this, so you've pressurized air, you have your powder here, and it's moving through this pipe network. When it gets to this point, what's going to happen is it's going to collide with this bend. So it just hits off the wall at high velocities. And in that circumstance, the most fragile particles in your powder are these agglomerated ones. So you can have a lovely, so this often happens, so we talk to companies where this happens. They've put tremendous investment into creating an agglomeration technology. And they're producing very large agglomerates that when they test them in the lab, they're performing excellently. But then they're getting complaints from their customers that it's actually terrible. It's not rehydrating at all. Okay? So often what happens is they have an agglomeration step back here before the pneumatic conveying, and they take their sample after this process, they test it in the lab and it's fantastic. But what the customer is actually getting is something that's been pneumatically conveyed through a pipe network like this. And the agglomerate might be very good here, but by the time it goes through this pipe end, it's after being ruined. Okay? And that can be a little bit of a mystery for processors to have to solve. It's a big problem in infant formula manufacture. So Yurio went through some of these steps. I'm sure there's different ways you can agglomerate powders, if you have a single atomizer, you will always get some random agglomeration, okay? Because you have to imagine in this cloud of droplets, some are really big and some are really small. Some will move faster than others. So if you have a straight line of droplets moving at this angle here, some of them will basically catch up with each other and they'll collide. And during the drying process, those droplets that have collided will form an agglomerate. Okay? So you don't just have a uniform velocity here because you've got different sizes. And when you have different sized droplets, they move at different velocities. And they will collide randomly. Now, if you want to force this process to happen, you can basically use two atomizer nozzles, both being fed with a concentrate, and you can place the nozzles at an angle such that the collisions will happen at a greater probability. Okay? So there you have wet droplets colliding, producing larger droplets, and then drying. Okay? Now this is a little bit different. Here again, you've got two nozzles with concentrate being fed, so this is liquid concentrate. And then in the middle, you have a nozzle that's supplying actual powder particles. Okay? So you have a mixture of solid particles and wet droplets. So can anyone think what the benefit would be of using this method here, the one where you have actual powder particles being introduced, compared to this one where you're just mixing liquid droplets? Can anyone think of why you would use some powder particles rather than just smash the droplets together? Say that again? Faster. Okay. Well, I could be wrong. I would think both processes would happen very rapidly. So you have collisions happening at very close quarters. I'd suspect that the collisions would happen quite rapidly. But it could be something, that could be something to look at. What I'm thinking, okay, is if you have two wet droplets being brought together, it could just be like if you have droplets of oil in a frying pan, okay? So you have two droplets of oil, what happens when they come into contact? They form one big droplet. So it's just like this example we gave earlier. You just form one big uniform droplet rather than this kind of cluster arrangement. Okay? So when you do this first agglomeration process here with droplets, you will get some agglomerate structures, which will also get a certain proportion of these uniform large droplets. And this has no real benefit when it comes to rehydration. Okay? So in this one, you introduce some fine powder particles that have been produced in the drying process, and you bring them into contact with wet droplets, and you create these cluster-type structures at a greater probability. Now, a similar process we encountered previously in the form of an internal fluidized bed. So you remember there was a multi-stage dryer. It had 3 stages of drying. It had the main chamber, it had the internal fluidized bed, and it had the external fluidized bed. And what the internal fluidized bed was, what it did, was it blew powder particles that had been formed at the bottom of the drying chamber back up into the atomization cloud. So it's a similar process to what we see here, except the collision of the particles is brought about through a slightly different mechanism. Okay, this is more details on agglomeration methods that I don't want to spend too much time on. So this is all material that you encountered with Uriel. So these are just some different additional methods of agglomeration, which again, I don't want to spend too much time on. Okay, so this is the point I want to make now, and Seamus will make it again at another time. Okay? But it's important for you to remember. So in the case of whole milk powders and in the case of skim milk powders, we typically want something that does this rather than this. Okay? We don't want something that floats at the surface of water. And what we can do with skim milk powder is we can create these agglomerate-like structures, and this will promote, as we said, capillary action in through these narrow pores that have been formed in the agglomerate, which promotes rapid solubilization. We can do the same with whole milk powder, but it doesn't work as effectively. So typically, in addition to agglomeration, you have to perform lecithination. Okay? Lecithination basically means the addition of lecithin. So lecithin is an emulsifier. There's a simple diagram here showing the red head of a lecithin molecule and then the black tail of the lecithin molecule. And what this is basically showing us is that the red heads are hydrophilic. They point out to the water phase, and the black tails are hydrophobic. They point towards the oil droplet. So it's an amphiphilic molecule. You've heard of it before, and it's an emulsifier. So what happens in the manufacture of whole milk powders, but also some whey protein powders, is lecithin is sprayed onto the powder after agglomeration. So you have an agglomerate structure like this, but it's also been sprayed with lecithin. So one of the things lecithin does is it reduces, because it's an emulsifier, it reduces the surface tension of water when it's added to water. So when you add a powder that has lecithin in it, when the powder makes contact with the water surface, the lecithin in the powder immediately reduces the surface tension of the water, which allows the powder to sink more rapidly into the water. So as I think I said before, the solution to the problem is built into the powder. Okay? Okay, so we're nearly there with milk powders, but this is just a useful summary slide of some of the topics we encountered. So we said there's a general flow diagram for milk powders, and there's some optional steps. One of the optional steps is homogenization. Obviously, we don't have to homogenize skim milk, okay? So we only homogenize if we've got fat or a significant level of fat in the system. In both cases, there's an evaporation step, but for skim milk, typically, the ambition with regards to the solids content is a little higher. So you can push the solids content of skim milk a little bit higher than whole milk because of its lower viscosity. Why does it have a lower viscosity? Because it has less fat. Remember that viscosity is the limiting factor when it comes to evaporation. Manufacturers would like to go to 60% or 70% with this evaporation step, but they can't with milk. Most skim milk is spray dried. A small proportion of whole milk powder is roller dried. There's one other powder that you're going to encounter that is sometimes roller dried, and that's sodium caseinate. And you should note that. That's important. The main reason, or there's probably two main reasons why roller drying might be performed. One is the practical reason that a given company may not have sufficient finances or space to have a spray dryer, because they're enormous. The roller dryers are compact and cheap. But probably a more important reason is that roller drying creates certain functional properties that are advantageous in specific applications. And the specific application is milk chocolate. So manufacturers of milk chocolate in Ireland, for example, prefer typically whole milk powder that has been roller dried. And this allows them to reduce their use of cocoa powder in their formulations. As we just said, when it comes to instantization, we can agglomerate the skim milk powder and that will do an excellent job. With the whole milk powder, we need a second step. Agglomeration isn't enough to create a soluble powder. Now lastly in this slide, I have a comment about nitrogen flushing. Nitrogen flushing of the package that holds the powder. And what this says is that during the packaging of skim milk powder, there's typically not nitrogen flushing, but during the packaging of whole milk powder, there can be nitrogen flushing. Does anyone know why that would be performed? Yeah, to prevent oxidation. So with whole milk powder, due to the presence of fat, there's a risk of oxidation. So if there's more oxygen, air in the system, there can be the promotion of rancidity during the storage of the powder. So sometimes the containers or the bags can be flushed to remove oxygen that can cause that problem. So the last few slides just show some important alternative powders, alternative milk powders that are also important to remember. So the first one here we encountered early on in this lecture sequence, which is fat-filled milk powder. So we said that sometimes a company will actually remove milk fat from the milk system and then add back in vegetable oils. And we said the reason for that is a company can take cream out of milk and then sell the cream, or they can take cream out of the milk and produce butter and sell the butter, and both of them are profitable materials. Subsequently, the company can then add oil back into the system to bring the energy content and the calorie content back up and sell the powder as a calorically dense material. So this is an example of one of these materials that are produced in Ireland. It's called VO milk, and it's primarily sold to African regions, I think. So this is produced in Ireland, and it's actually a fairly major product. So it's very profitable because the oil that's added is very cheap, and it's sold at a fairly good return. So of course there's many different types of oils, and they all have different properties. So here two of them are highlighted: palm oil and sunflower oil. Palm oil is solid at room temperature. Sunflower oil is liquid at room temperature. So if you're adding palm oil to a milk system so that you can create a fat-filled milk powder, you need to melt the palm oil before you add it. And then subsequently, if you compare those two powders, one with palm oil and one with sunflower oil, you would expect that they have different functional properties. In addition to functional properties, you can also have differences in nutritional properties. So this is a table of the various fatty acids that can be found in these oils. A manufacturer can effectively tweak the nutritional profile of a fat-filled milk powder depending on the type of oil that they use. Another powder that's being produced in increasing quantities is lactose-free milk powder. So you've probably seen lactose-free milks, drinking milks, for sale in supermarkets, but increasingly lactose-free milk powders are being produced in very large quantities. So you probably know from maybe lectures with Tom O'Connor that a very large proportion of people in the world are lactose intolerant. So I think it's 70 to 80% of people in the world are lactose intolerant. So they struggle to digest lactose. And as we know, skim milk powder in the Irish context, for example, is typically made for export around the world. And many of the places it's exported are populated by people who may not be able to digest lactose. So this might seem like a small little tweak in the formulation or process, but it's a fairly important one economically, given that so many people, the majority of people in the world, are lactose intolerant. Does anyone know how you might produce a lactose-free skim milk powder? What extra thing would you have to do?
Add sugar.
Add sugar? What would happen to lactose?
Add lactase.
Add lactase, yeah. So what's lactase?
Enzyme.
Yeah, it's an enzyme that specifically hydrolyzes lactose into its two monosaccharides, so glucose and galactose. And it's not that easy. So you add lactase, you produce two sugars, but they're sweeter than lactose. So the powder tastes different, or the reconstituted powder tastes different. And glucose is more reactive than lactose. So if you heat the milk after the lactase has been added, it might be more prone to browning reactions. So producing these lactose-free powders create new problems, which is always the case. So oftentimes, so this company here is a Finnish company, Valio. They're a Finnish dairy processing company. They produce a lot of lactose-free powders. I think their process is they add lactase, they produce the two smaller sugars, galactose and glucose, then they filter the milk to bring down the level of the sugars. So you can imagine, you take lactose, it's not a very sweet sugar, you generate two sugars that create a greater sweetness. This creates a property for that milk powder that's undesirable. So what they do is they filter out some of that sugar to bring the sensory profile back into where it should be, and then they dry it. Another trend that's increasing is the production of non-bovine milk powder. Probably the most popular non-bovine milk powder is goat milk powder. One of the reasons this is becoming popular in the dairy processing industry is that there's an increased interest in goat milk-based infant formula. So there's goat milk-based infant formula being produced, and there's various health claims associated with goat milk. Some of them may be dubious. So one of the apparent, or one of the proposed benefits of goat milk is that the casein in goat's milk forms a softer clot in the stomach. So they're sometimes marketed as being easier to digest for infants, okay? And if a company, I think there's a company in Britain who manufactures goat milk infant formula, if they're manufacturing infant formula, they'll need goat milk powder. So as soon as there's a company that's making goat milk infant formula, they need another company that makes goat milk powder, so that they can formulate the infant formula. Now if you go on the internet, there's also other claims, like goat milk infant formula is better for your baby if your baby is lactose intolerant. But goat milk does contain lactose, so that's just nonsense. But that's the reason why some people are buying it. Okay, unlike milk powder, there will be an exam question on casein. Okay? There will be a casein question in the exam for me. Now, unfortunately for you, there's 3 different types of casein powder I'm going to be talking about. Okay? So as we go through them, I'll still try to be fairly transparent about what you need to know. But keep in mind that, for example, if a question comes up in sodium caseinate, and if you've studied sodium caseinate, you might be disadvantaged if you didn't study anything on acid casein, because sodium caseinate is made from acid casein. Okay? So if you know something about both, it helps you answer a question on each of them individually. Okay? So again, don't just discard one of them if I make a hint that one of them is more likely to come up in the exam. Okay, this slide is just saying that Ireland manufactures a huge amount of casein in the form of rennet casein, acid casein, and sodium caseinate. So the majority of Irish casein production right now, this is subject to change, is rennet casein. And as we'll see when it comes to rennet casein is something that has a very limited range of applications. So it's mainly used to make cheese for frozen pizzas, basically. Processed cheese, analog cheese. So globally, we have a far greater production of caseinate, mainly in the form of sodium caseinate. Does anyone remember why? I think I talked about this last semester. Why would there be more sodium caseinate produced globally? Does anyone remember two problems with rennet casein and acid casein that limit its application, limit water application? They're insoluble. So you make them by rendering the casein in milk insoluble. So you have two insoluble materials, you can't use them in beverages. And beverages are probably the single biggest application of many of these types of ingredients. So sodium caseinate is produced in larger quantities because sodium caseinate is useful in more applications. So it's not really possible to talk about producing casein ingredients without talking a little bit about the chemistry of milk proteins. We're not going to talk about a lot of it. It's just mainly the top level stuff that you need to be able to understand some of the process steps. Generally, I would say for the exam, you need to remember things like process flow diagrams, but you also need to explain some of the chemistry behind some of the steps. Okay? So if there's an acidification step during the manufacture of acid casein, for example, it's not good enough just to say, it's acidified here. You say, this is an acidification step. This is what the acidification step does. It brings down the pH to 4.6. It reduces the net negative charge on the casein. It causes coagulation of the casein at its isoelectric point. All that stuff is relevant, okay? So milk contains about 3.2% protein. 80% of that protein is casein. So the first ingredients that were manufactured from milk a long time ago were casein. Because it was found quite early on that if you have an acidified milk system, for example, it is prone to forming clots, which can be easily separated from the liquid whey. So casein ingredients were invented much earlier than whey protein ingredients. They've been around for a much longer time. And here we see some of the basic differences between casein and whey. So here we have our isoelectric point of casein. At that pH, casein is insoluble. So an easy way to prepare casein from milk is to reduce its pH to 4.6. The second important thing that makes casein insoluble is the addition of a proteolytic enzyme called rennet. Okay? And you've encountered all this stuff before. Okay? But you need to use this information in the exam. Okay? People still, someone will mix up isoelectric and enzymatic precipitation when they're talking about the process to make acid casein. So just make sure you have some of this basic information down. Now, another important property here that won't become significant for us until a few lectures' time is the fact that casein micelles are huge. Okay? Whey proteins are molecules that it's difficult to even put a number on their size. They may be something like 1 nanometer or less. So they're really tiny. They're actual molecules. They're really small. In their normal state, you can't see them under a microscope. They're tiny, okay? Casein micelles are comparatively massive, okay? Because as you know, it's not just 1 casein molecule, 2 casein molecule. It's thousands of casein molecules together in a large particle-like structure. The practical consequence of this, that's very important in the food industry at the moment in terms of ingredients, is that it's very easy to use filters to separate casein proteins from whey proteins. Okay? So we'll see later, okay, if you run a gel and you look at the molecular weight of whey proteins, alpha-lactalbumin has a molecular weight of 14 kilodalton. Beta-lactoglobulin has a molecular weight of 18 kilodalton. There's some whey proteins that are called large whey proteins, and they've got molecular weights of 80 kilodalton. A casein micelle has a molecular weight of 1 million kilodaltons. Okay? So it's very, very big. And this is our micelle structure. This was made or drawn by a famous scientist called Douglas Dalgleish, a Scottish guy. And it's probably the easiest structure to understand. It's the least messy diagram of the casein micelle structure. And on the surface, we have our kappa casein. And that's the stabilizing layer that we referred to before. This is the layer we said that whey proteins can interact with this layer and produce a larger stabilizing surface. So we have our kappa casein at the surface. It has a hydrophilic tail, which allows it to face into the water-rich phase outside the micelle. Now, in the center, we have a lot of these red proteins. They're not actually red, but in the diagram there. And these are the more hydrophobic caseins. And the more hydrophobic caseins are the alpha caseins and the beta caseins. So all the kappa casein, or the majority of kappa casein, is located at the surface. And then in the core of the micelle, we've got our alpha caseins and beta caseins. And the alpha caseins and the beta caseins are held together by hydrophobic interactions. So the alpha caseins and the beta caseins have amino acids in their amino acid sequence that are very hydrophobic. And when those hydrophobic regions meet, they stick together like Velcro. Okay? So that's one of the cohesive interactions that hold this structure together. This isn't important for me or my lectures, but it might become important when you're talking to Seamus if he talks about beta casein ingredients. The main point here about beta casein is that you can make beta casein migrate into the serum phase. Okay? Beta casein is an ingredient produced by Kerry Foods. Kerry Foods are trying to get infant formula manufacturers to put beta casein into infant formula. So Kerry have a process, I don't know how they do it, I know other ways to do it, but Kerry have a process which basically forces beta casein into the serum phase. The beta casein is very small, and now it becomes very easy to separate from the very large micelle. More important for you to remember is that the casein micelle is held together by something called CCP. Does anyone remember what that stands for? Colloidal calcium phosphate. One important second question. How is the solubility of CCP affected by pH? Unlike the beta casein comment, this is relevant to my section of this module and all that. Does anyone know? Solubility low pH. Yeah, that's important. Okay, so CCP, or calcium phosphate in general, is soluble at acid pH. So the more acid the system, the more soluble the CCP. So the presence of this CCP is very interesting biologically. Again, you probably heard about this before, but calcium phosphate is a very insoluble salt. If you try to add as much calcium phosphate as is present in milk to a beverage, for example, it is impossible because it's so insoluble. But the casein micelle acts as a type of stabilizing vehicle that delivers calcium phosphate to people who consume it. Okay? So that's an interesting biological property of the casein. It's a mechanism by which calcium phosphate can be delivered in larger quantities that are otherwise allowed by chemistry, the laws of chemistry. Important for you in this module is, one, when we start talking about milk protein concentrates and micellar casein concentrates, one of the advantages or one of the properties of those ingredients that people are excited about, particularly in a nutrition application context, is the fact that we don't just have a protein structure here, we also have a mineral structure. So you can add casein and micellars to food products and you get two benefits. You get protein and you get calcium phosphate. Okay? So that's one of the reasons people are interested in those materials. The other reason I want you to remember CCP is that when you make acid casein, you have to acidify. So you produce a casein precipitate in acid conditions. You also generate a liquid whey. Due to the fact that you solubilize the calcium phosphate goes into the liquid whey. That is a characteristic of something called acid whey. So this all sounds so obvious. It sounds so simple that everyone forgets it, okay? So, soluble in acid pH, you have to acidify to make acid casein. The co-product of acid casein is acid whey, and the acid whey contains a lot of soluble calcium phosphate, okay? And that doesn't happen when you use rennet, because you don't acidify with rennet. So you end up with two different whey fractions. One of them is easy to use, one of them is really difficult to use. One of them is a problem, one of them is not a problem. So we'll talk about that again next time. Thank you.